The Jeffersons were a family of four: Jamal, his wife Vanessa, and their two children, 14-year-old Mia and 9-year-old Andre. They had just moved into a quaint neighborhood on Elm Street, known for its tree-lined streets, beautifully maintained lawns, and an overall aura of suburban serenity. Jamal, tall and confident, had recently been promoted to the position of police chief. Vanessa, warm and kind-hearted, worked as a teacher. They had both worked tirelessly to provide the best for their family, and this new home was a symbol of all their hard work. As they settled into their new home, the Jeffersons wanted to get to know their neighbors. They planned a big welcoming barbecue, hoping it would be a chance to connect and make some new friends. But as they unpacked boxes and planted flowers in their front yard, they couldn't shake the feeling that not everyone was happy to see them. One of their neighbors, Mr. Robert Caldwell, had lived on Elm Street for over 35 years. To him, the neighborhood was his sanctuary, a place where things were done a certain way, his way. As soon as he saw the Jeffersons pull into their driveway, his eyes narrowed. He didn't like change, and the sight of a new black family moving in was, in his mind, a disruption to the peace he cherished. Robert had no interest in getting to know his new neighbors. He was determined to make sure they knew they didn't belong. Despite the initial cold reception, Vanessa refused to give up. She knew some people took time to warm up, and she was willing to show kindness no matter what. She often saw Mr. Caldwell out in his yard, meticulously trimming his bushes or sweeping his driveway, and she decided to take the first step. "Good morning. I'm Vanessa Jefferson. We just moved in across the street," she called out one morning, giving him her warmest smile. Mr. Caldwell barely looked up from his task. "Yeah, I know," he replied, his tone dismissive. Robert Caldwell. Without another word, he turned his back and continued with his sweeping. Vanessa's smile faltered slightly, but she kept her composure. She walked back to her garden, telling herself that first impressions could change. Maybe with time, Mr. Caldwell would see that they were good people who only wanted to be part of the community. The Jeffersons continued with their preparations for the barbecue, inviting all the neighbors and hoping for a good turnout. Jamal worked tirelessly in the backyard, setting up the grill and arranging chairs while Mia and Andre helped their mom decorate the porch with colorful streamers. The Jeffersons were determined to make their new home a place filled with warmth and laughter, regardless of the chilly reception from some of their neighbors. "Do you think Mr. Caldwell will come?" Mia asked her mom as they hung up decorations. Vanessa looked across the street, where Mr. Caldwell was once again pacing his front yard, his eyes occasionally flicking over to their house. She sighed softly but then gave Mia a smile. "Maybe. And if he doesn't, that's okay too. We're still going to have a wonderful time." On the day of the barbecue, the Jeffersons were hopeful. They had set up tables laden with food, juicy burgers, grilled vegetables, Vanessa's famous potato salad, and a variety of desserts. Jamal stood by the grill, expertly flipping burgers, while Andre eagerly ran around the yard, setting up games for the other children. Mia arranged a table with lemonade and sweet tea, carefully placing cups for anyone who might want a refreshing drink. A few of their neighbors began to arrive, and Vanessa's heart lifted. The Thompsons, a young couple from 2 houses down, came with a dish of pasta salad. The Ramirez family showed up as well, their children quickly joining Mia and Andre in a game of tag. Even Mr. and Mrs. Parker, an elderly couple who had lived on Elm Street almost as long as Mr. Caldwell, came by with a warm pie. Vanessa exchanged smiles with Jamal. It seemed like things were starting to look up. She glanced over at Mr. Caldwell's house, hoping to see him making his way over, but his blinds were drawn, and there was no sign of him. She took a deep breath and turned her attention back to her guests, determined to enjoy the day and make everyone feel welcome. The barbecue was soon in full swing. Laughter echoed through the yard as children played, and the adults mingled, enjoying the food and the warm afternoon sun. Jamal chatted easily with Mr. Thompson about the local schools, while Vanessa exchanged recipes with Mrs. Parker. It felt like, despite the initial hesitation from some, the neighborhood was beginning to open up to them. But as the day went on, Vanessa couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She caught glimpses of Mr. Caldwell peering through his window, his expression unreadable. She tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the joy around her. Mia laughing as she chased Andre, Jamal smiling as he served another round of burgers, and the neighbors slowly warming up to their family. Maybe he'll come around, Vanessa whispered to herself. She wanted to believe that kindness and patience could change even the coldest of hearts. For now, though, she focused on what she could control, making this new house a true home for her family and creating the kind of community she knew they all deserved. A few days after the Jeffersons moved in, Vanessa decided to introduce herself to Mr. Caldwell, who she often saw pacing his front lawn, pretending to busy himself while keeping a watchful eye on their house. One morning, while tending her flower garden, she took a deep breath and waved at him. "Good morning. I'm Vanessa Jefferson. We just moved in across the street," she called out with a warm smile. Mr. Caldwell looked up, his expression cold. "Yeah, I know. Robert Caldwell," he replied curtly, then quickly turned his back, walking away without another word. Vanessa felt the weight of his disapproval, but she refused to let it get to her. She knew some people took time to warm up to new neighbors, and she was determined to show kindness in return. The Jeffersons continued to make efforts to be friendly, greeting the neighbors and even inviting them to their upcoming barbecue. They received a mix of reactions, some warm, some cold, and others indifferent. But they carried on with their plans, refusing to let anyone's negativity affect their joy of moving into their dream home. One Saturday, as the family set up for the barbecue, with Mia helping her mom arrange the chairs and Andre eagerly helping his dad with the grill, Vanessa spotted Mr. Caldwell peeking out from his window. She sighed, hoping that maybe the event could break the ice between them. "Maybe he'll come by," she said to Jamal, who gave her a supportive smile. "Maybe," he replied. "And if not, that's on him, not us." The day of the barbecue arrived, and the Jeffersons were determined to make it a success. Vanessa had prepared a spread of delicious dishes, juicy burgers, grilled vegetables, her famous potato salad, and a variety of homemade desserts. Jamal had set up the grill in the backyard, and Mia and Andre had decorated the yard with colorful streamers and balloons. The first guests started arriving, and Vanessa greeted each one warmly, relieved to see a few familiar faces. The Thompsons, who had come over with a dish of pasta salad during their first week, were among the first to arrive, followed by the Ramirez family and the Parkers. The children quickly began playing together, laughter and excitement filling the air as they chased each other around the yard. Vanessa glanced across the street at Mr. Caldwell's house, hoping to see him making his way over, but his front door remained closed, and the blinds were drawn. She sighed, pushing the thought aside, and focused on making sure her guests were comfortable. Jamal, ever the gracious host, worked the grill, flipping burgers and chatting with the neighbors. He was in his element, his calm demeanor putting everyone at ease. Vanessa moved around the yard, offering drinks and making sure everyone had enough to eat. Despite the initial coolness from some of the neighbors, the atmosphere began to warm, and she could feel a genuine sense of community forming. But Mr. Caldwell's absence weighed on her mind. Every so often, she caught a glimpse of movement behind his blinds, as if he were watching but refusing to participate. She wished she could find a way to bridge the gap, to show him that they were not a threat to his precious neighborhood, but she knew it wasn't something she could force. The barbecue continued, and soon the yard was filled with laughter and conversation. The children played games, their joy infectious, and the adults mingled, sharing stories and getting to know one another. Vanessa felt her heart swell with hope. Perhaps, over time, they could truly become a part of this community. As the sun began to set, the Jeffersons lit a few lanterns, casting a warm glow over the yard. Jamal stood with Mr. Thompson, discussing local events, while Vanessa found herself chatting with Mrs. Ramirez about their children's school. It was the kind of evening Vanessa had dreamed of, a sense of belonging, of being surrounded by people who cared. But as she glanced once more at Mr. Caldwell's house, she saw the blinds shift slightly, and she knew he was still watching, still judging. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that change took time, that hearts didn't soften overnight. She turned her attention back to her guests, determined not to let one person's bitterness overshadow the joy they had managed to create. The barbecue finally began to wind down, the children tired from running around, their laughter turning to yawns. The neighbors thanked the Jeffersons for the wonderful evening, promising to stay in touch. As the last guests left, Vanessa and Jamal stood together, looking at the yard filled with empty plates and chairs, the remnants of a successful gathering. "I think it went well," Vanessa said, leaning into Jamal's side. "It did," he agreed, wrapping an arm around her. "Not everyone was here, but the ones who came had a good time. That's what matters." Vanessa nodded, her eyes drifting back to Mr. Caldwell's house. "Do you think he'll ever come around?" Jamal followed her gaze, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe, maybe not. But we'll keep being ourselves, and maybe one day he'll see that we're not so different." Vanessa smiled, a sense of determination settling within her. "One day," she echoed. As they began to clean up, Mia and Andre joined them, helping to gather the plates and put away the decorations. Despite the lingering tension from Mr. Caldwell, Vanessa felt a sense of peace. They had made progress today, small, but significant. And as long as they kept moving forward, she knew they could create the kind of community they had always dreamed of, a place where everyone felt welcome, no matter where they came from or who they were. It wasn't about changing Mr. Caldwell overnight. It was about showing him and everyone else that they belonged, that they were here to stay, and that, perhaps one day, even the most resistant hearts could be softened by kindness and perseverance. That afternoon, as the barbecue got into full swing, the Jeffersons' backyard was filled with the sound of laughter, sizzling meat, and the buzz of friendly conversation. Several of their new neighbors had shown up, curious to get to know the family and enjoy the festivities. Mia and Andre played games with the other neighborhood kids, and Vanessa and Jamal moved around, making sure everyone had enough food and drinks. Mr. Caldwell, however, had no intention of joining. He watched the gathering from his window, the sound of laughter and music gnawing at him. The sight of neighbors mingling with the Jeffersons infuriated him. He picked up his phone, his hand trembling as he dialed 911. "911, what's your emergency?" the dispatcher answered. Robert's voice was full of feigned concern. "I'd like to report a disturbance at my neighbor's house," he said. "There's a lot of noise, and I'm worried something suspicious might be going on. It's been going on for hours now, and I'm concerned for our safety." The dispatcher assured him that officers would be sent to check it out. Robert hung up the phone with a satisfied smirk. He was sure that this would put the Jeffersons in their place. Meanwhile, at the barbecue, everything was going smoothly. Vanessa and Jamal were relieved that despite a few cold receptions from some neighbors, many were warming up to them. The atmosphere was joyful, and they were starting to feel like they were becoming part of the community. But then, they noticed the flashing lights of a police car pulling up in front of their house. The laughter died down as everyone turned to see what was happening. Jamal's face hardened, and Vanessa looked at him with concern. "What could this be about?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sudden hush. Jamal took a deep breath, putting on the calm, authoritative demeanor that had served him well during his years as an officer. "Let's find out," he said, walking toward the front yard to meet the officers. The two officers approached, their faces neutral but cautious. As they reached the gate, Jamal raised his hand in greeting. "Good afternoon, officers. I'm Jamal Jefferson, the homeowner here. Is there a problem?" One of the officers, a younger man with a serious expression, cleared his throat. "We received a call about a noise disturbance and some suspicious activity," he explained, glancing past Jamal at the gathering in the backyard. Jamal nodded, keeping his composure. "Well, as you can see, we're just having a barbecue with some of our neighbors. Nothing out of the ordinary." The officer hesitated, clearly unsure of how to proceed. His partner, an older woman with a more relaxed demeanor, stepped forward. She seemed to recognize Jamal, her eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to place him. "Wait a minute," she said, her tone shifting. "Aren't you Chief Jefferson?" Jamal gave a small, tight smile. "Yes, I am. I was recently appointed the new chief of police." The younger officer's eyes widened slightly, and he exchanged a quick glance with his partner. The older officer nodded, her demeanor softening. "Chief, we didn't realize this was your residence. We're sorry for the disturbance." Jamal shook his head, though his jaw was set with tension. "No need to apologize. You're just doing your job. But as you can see, there's nothing suspicious happening here. Just a family gathering." The older officer nodded again, clearly embarrassed. "Of course, sir. We'll let the dispatcher know everything's fine. She turned to her partner, gesturing for him to follow her back to the patrol car. As the officers walked away, Vanessa joined Jamal, her face pale but composed. Is everything okay? She asked softly. Jamal nodded, watching as the police car pulled away from the curb. Yeah. Someone called in a noise complaint, he said, his voice tight with frustration. Probably Caldwell. Vanessa's eyes widened, and she glanced toward Mr. Caldwell's house. The blinds were still drawn, but she could almost feel his eyes on them, watching. Why would he do that? She whispered, her heart aching at the thought of someone harboring so much animosity toward them. Jamal took a deep breath, his expression softening as he looked at his wife. Some people don't like change, Vanessa. They see us as a threat, even when all we're trying to do is fit in. Vanessa reached for his hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. Well, we're not going anywhere, she said firmly. This is our home now, and we're going to keep being ourselves, no matter what. Jamal smiled at her, a mixture of pride and love in his eyes. That's right, he agreed. We're not going anywhere. The barbecue slowly resumed, though the mood had shifted. The neighbors who had witnessed the police arriving were visibly uncomfortable, some offering awkward smiles and others avoiding eye contact altogether. Vanessa and Jamal did their best to reassure everyone, moving through the crowd with warm smiles and light conversation, determined not to let the incident ruin the day. Mrs. Parker, the elderly neighbor who had brought over a pie, approached Vanessa, her brow furrowed with concern. I'm so sorry, dear, she said quietly. I can't believe someone would call the police over something like this. Vanessa forced a smile, her heart heavy. Thank you, Mrs. Parker. We're just trying to make the best of it. Mrs. Parker patted Vanessa's arm gently. You're good people. Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong. Vanessa's eyes welled with tears, and she quickly blinked them away. Thank you, she whispered. That means a lot. As the evening wore on, the Jeffersons worked hard to bring the mood back up. Mia and Andre led the other children in a game of tag, their laughter slowly filling the air once more. Jamal continued to man the grill, flipping burgers and hot dogs, while Vanessa moved through the crowd, making sure everyone had enough to eat and drink. The neighbors who stayed seemed determined to show their support. Conversations resumed, and the laughter slowly returned, though there was an unspoken understanding among them all. What had happened was not right, and it had left a mark on the day. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the barbecue came to an end, Jamal and Vanessa stood together, watching as their neighbors slowly made their way home. Despite the incident, they knew they had made progress. People had shown up, they had shared food and laughter, and they had begun to build connections. Do you think it'll get better? Vanessa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jamal wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. I think it will. It's going to take time, but we'll get there. One step at a time. Vanessa nodded, resting her head against his shoulder. One step at a time, she echoed, her heart filled with both hope and determination. As they began to clean up, Mia and Andre ran over, their faces flushed with excitement. Can we do this again, Mom? Andre asked, his eyes shining with hope. Vanessa smiled, ruffling his hair. Of course we can. This is just the beginning. And as they stood there, surrounded by the remnants of their first barbecue in their new home, the Jeffersons knew that they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, together. The two officers approached, their expressions neutral. As soon as they saw Jamal, they recognized him. One of the officers cleared his throat, clearly caught off guard. Chief Jefferson? We didn't realize this was your residence, he said, his tone immediately shifting to one of respect. Jamal looked at them evenly. What's going on, officers? He asked, though he already had a pretty good idea. We received a call about a noise disturbance and some suspicious activity, the officer replied, glancing back at the barbecue. He could see that it was nothing more than a family gathering, neighbors enjoying a sunny afternoon together. Jamal nodded. Well, as you can see, we're just having a barbecue. Nothing suspicious here. The officers looked around, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. They had been expecting something entirely different, and now they realized that this was just an innocent family event. We're sorry for the inconvenience, Chief. We'll make a quick check around and be on our way. Jamal gestured for them to proceed. Of course, do what you need to do. The officers made a cursory check, confirming that there was no issue, then turned back to Jamal. Everything looks good here. Again, our apologies, sir. Jamal nodded, though his jaw was set tight. Thank you, officers. Have a good day. As the officers left, the mood at the barbecue was noticeably subdued. The Jeffersons' guests had watched the interaction, their earlier laughter replaced by a mix of confusion and discomfort. Vanessa walked over to Jamal, slipping her hand into his. I'm sorry, she whispered. It's not your fault, Jamal said, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. This is just the reality we live in. Vanessa looked at him, her eyes full of empathy. I know, but it still hurts. We were finally starting to feel like we belonged here. Jamal gave her a reassuring smile, though the heaviness in his eyes remained. We'll get through this. We always do. He looked around at their guests, many of whom were still lingering, unsure of what to say or do. He took a deep breath and raised his voice, addressing everyone. Hey, everyone, thank you for your patience. We're all good here, so let's get back to enjoying this beautiful day. Vanessa squeezed his hand, grateful for his strength. Slowly, the atmosphere began to recover. The neighbors offered tentative smiles, and the children, sensing the tension had eased, resumed their games. Jamal returned to the grill, flipping burgers with practiced ease, while Vanessa moved through the crowd, making sure everyone felt comfortable once again. Mrs. Ramirez, one of their neighbors, approached Vanessa, her face lined with concern. I'm so sorry that happened, she said quietly. You and your family deserve better. Vanessa smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. Thank you, Mrs. Ramirez. We're just trying to make the best of it. Well, for what it's worth, Mrs. Ramirez continued, we're glad you're here. And if you ever need anything, you just let us know. Vanessa's eyes glistened with emotion, and she nodded. That means a lot. Thank you. As the barbecue continued, the Jeffersons' resilience shone through. Though the incident with the police had cast a shadow over the day, they refused to let it define their experience. Jamal and Vanessa worked tirelessly to ensure their guests felt welcome and at ease, their determination to create a sense of community undiminished. By the time the sun began to set, the laughter had returned, and the warmth of the gathering was palpable once more. The Jeffersons knew that there would always be challenges, but they also knew that they were not alone. Their neighbors' support, however small, was a step in the right direction. As they cleaned up at the end of the day, Vanessa looked at Jamal, her heart full of both love and determination. We'll keep doing this, she said, her voice steady. No matter what, we'll show them who we really are. Jamal nodded, his expression softening. Absolutely. We're here to stay. And one day, they'll see that we belong. The incident at the barbecue was a turning point for the neighborhood. Word spread quickly about what had happened, and many neighbors were shocked to learn that the new family had been targeted like that. The Jeffersons had been nothing but kind and welcoming, and yet, someone had tried to intimidate them. Mrs. Parker, one of the neighbors who had attended the barbecue, decided it was time to do something. She spoke to Jamal and Vanessa, offering her support. We can't let this slide, she said firmly. This neighborhood is better than this. Jamal and Vanessa were touched by the outpouring of support from the neighbors who had attended the barbecue. Together with Mrs. Parker and a few others, they organized a community meeting at the local park, inviting everyone to come and talk openly about what had happened. The day of the meeting, dozens of neighbors showed up. There was a sense of unease in the air, but also a determination to make things right. Jamal stood before them, speaking openly about his experience, about what it felt like to be treated with suspicion simply because of who they were. We moved here because we wanted to be part of a community, Jamal said, his voice strong and clear. We wanted our children to grow up in a place where they felt safe, where they felt like they belonged. And we still believe in that vision. But we can't do it alone. Vanessa spoke next, her voice filled with emotion. We want our children to see the best in people. We want them to know that even when things are hard, even when people treat you unfairly, there is still goodness. That's why we're here today, to find that goodness together. As they spoke, many neighbors nodded in agreement. Even those who had been distant at first could feel the sincerity of the Jeffersons' words. Slowly, one by one, people began to speak up. Some shared their own experiences of prejudice, while others apologized for not being more welcoming. And then, to everyone's surprise, Mr. Caldwell stood up. He looked around, his face flushed. "I made the call," he admitted, his voice trembling. "I was wrong. I let my fears and prejudices get the better of me. And I see now how much hurt I've caused. I'm truly sorry." The crowd was silent for a moment, and then Mrs. Parker spoke up. "Thank you for admitting that, Robert. It takes courage to face your mistakes. But words aren't enough. We need to work together to make sure this doesn't happen again." Mr. Caldwell nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "I want to do better," he said quietly. The meeting continued, and what had started as a tense gathering slowly transformed into something hopeful. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other before found themselves sharing stories, expressing their fears, and discovering common ground. It wasn't just about the Jeffersons anymore. It was about the entire neighborhood coming to terms with the biases and fears that had kept them apart. Mrs. Ramirez spoke next, her voice steady and confident. "We all need to do better. We need to make sure that every family feels welcome here, no matter where they come from or what they look like. This is our home, and it's up to us to make it the kind of place we want to live in." Jamal looked out at the faces of his neighbors, feeling a sense of hope rising within him. "It's going to take all of us," he said. "We need to be willing to look at ourselves, to challenge our own beliefs, and to stand up for each other. This isn't just about my family. It's about all of us." The meeting ended with a renewed sense of purpose. People lingered, talking in small groups, making plans to meet up again, to work together on making the neighborhood a better place for everyone. Mr. Caldwell approached Jamal and Vanessa, his face filled with regret. "I'm truly sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I can't take back what I did, but I want to make it right. I want to be part of the solution." Jamal looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. It means a lot that you're willing to change. We all make mistakes, but it's what we do after that counts." Vanessa offered him a small smile. "We appreciate your honesty. Let's move forward together." Mr. Caldwell nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek. "I'd like that," he said. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to change. The community meeting had sparked something, a desire to connect, to understand, to grow. Jamal and Vanessa, with the help of Mrs. Parker, Mrs. Ramirez, and even Mr. Caldwell, organized more gatherings. They held potlucks, game nights, and even started a neighborhood gardening project where everyone could contribute. Mr. Caldwell, true to his word, made an effort to get to know the Jeffersons and other neighbors. He joined the gardening project, working side by side with Jamal and Vanessa, learning about their lives, their hopes, and their dreams. Slowly, the walls he had built around himself began to crumble, replaced by genuine connections. One Saturday morning, as the neighborhood gathered to work on the garden, Mr. Caldwell found himself laughing with Mia and Andre as they planted flowers together. He looked over at Jamal, who was helping Mrs. Ramirez build a new planter box, and felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. This was what community was supposed to feel like. People coming together, supporting each other, growing together. The changes weren't just in Mr. Caldwell. The entire neighborhood began to feel different. People who had once kept to themselves were now spending time together, sharing meals, helping each other with projects, and watching out for one another. The sense of isolation that had once permeated Elm Street was replaced by a sense of belonging. Vanessa watched these changes with a full heart. She saw her children playing freely with their friends, their laughter echoing down the street. She saw neighbors helping each other, sharing stories, and building a true community. And she knew that despite the challenges they had faced, despite the hurt and the fear, they had found something beautiful here. One evening, as the sun set over the neighborhood, Jamal and Vanessa sat on their porch, watching the children play and the neighbors chat. Jamal turned to Vanessa, a soft smile on his face. "We did it," he said quietly. Vanessa nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "We did. It wasn't easy, but we did it." Jamal wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "This is what it's all about, fighting for the kind of world we want our kids to grow up in. And I think we're on the right track." Vanessa leaned her head on his shoulder, a sense of deep contentment washing over her. "One step at a time," she whispered. Jamal smiled, his gaze drifting out to the scene before them. A neighborhood once divided, now united. "One step at a time," he echoed. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, the Jeffersons knew that they had found their place. Not just a house, but a home. A community that had faced its fears, challenged its prejudices, and come out stronger on the other side. And they knew that this was just the beginning, that together, they could build something truly beautiful, one step at a time. The community meeting was the beginning of a change on Elm Street. The neighbors came together, organizing more events and making a real effort to get to know one another. They started a community garden, a project that allowed everyone to work side by side, learning about each other's stories and building real connections. Mr. Caldwell, once a symbol of the old guard, became one of the most active participants in the community garden. He worked alongside Jamal, Vanessa, and the rest of the neighborhood, determined to prove that he could change. The Jeffersons, too, found a sense of belonging they hadn't been sure was possible after the BBQ incident. They knew that not everyone would change overnight, but they also knew that they were not alone. Together, the neighborhood grew into something better, a place where differences were celebrated and everyone had a voice. As they stood in the middle of the thriving community garden, surrounded by neighbors who had become friends, Jamal and Vanessa felt a deep sense of hope. They had faced hostility, but they had responded with grace, unity, and determination. And in doing so, they had helped transform Elm Street into a true community. What would you have done if you were in Jamal and Vanessa's position? Would you have responded with grace and unity, or would you have hesitated? If you enjoyed this story of community resilience and reconciliation, please consider subscribing to our channel. We put a lot of effort into creating impactful narratives, and your support truly means the world to us. Thank you for being a part of this journey.